I love one scene from John chapter 8 because it pulls together many of the questions I have about what I call grace abuse. In that scene, Jesus is teaching in the temple. He's basically conducting a church service. Suddenly, the service is dramatically interrupted. Some Pharisees enter, dragging along a woman who's been stripped to the waist as a mark of shame. You can imagine how such an interruption would affect the tone of the average church service today. This woman has been caught in the very act of adultery, the Pharisees declare. Now, every instance of adultery that I know about involves two people, but we hear nothing about the man involved here. It becomes clear that the Pharisees were less interested in justice than in trapping Jesus. If he says something like, "Everybody makes mistakes, just let her go," then he's not a true prophet after all. If he says, "Moses' law is clear, this woman should be stoned," then they can turn him in to the Roman authorities because the Jews weren't allowed to conduct capital punishment. They've caught Jesus in a catch-22 situation, they think. I love this scene because it's the only scene in the Gospels that shows Jesus doing my profession, writing. In the midst of that tension, Jesus stoops on the ground and writes. I've got to tell you that it's humbling for me as a writer because the only time we see Jesus writing, he writes on sand. The next rain or windstorm that comes along will obliterate what he writes. Even worse, John doesn't bother to tell us what he wrote. I have my own theory about what Jesus wrote. Perhaps he wrote something like, "Annas, who was that woman knocking on your door at 2 a.m. last night?" Or, "Simeon, what was it that you wrote on line 22 of your tax return last year?" That's all speculation, though. What Jesus said after he stopped writing was this: "Whoever is without sin, let him cast the first stone." One by one, all the Pharisees filed away, leaving Jesus alone with the woman, cringing at his feet, expecting any moment to be executed. The Pharisees, like many of us, saw two groups of people in that cast of characters: good people, like themselves, and bad people, like that woman caught in the act of adultery. Jesus saw two groups of people too, but they were different categories. He saw sinners who admitted it, like the woman caught red-handed, and sinners who denied it, like the Pharisees. And the fact is, God can only work with people who admit their need. Remember, grace is a gift, and the only way you can receive a gift is to open your hands. If your hands are closed tight, like the Pharisees, if you think something like, "I'm doing just fine, thank you, I don't need God's grace, I'm a good, responsible citizen," the plain fact is, if you think like that, God cannot help you. On the other hand, no matter what you've done, no matter what, if you hold out open hands and ask for God's grace, he gladly gives it. He said to the woman, "Where are your accusers?" "Then neither do I condemn you. Go and leave your life of sin." In fact, if you go through the Bible, you can see that the people God uses most are people who messed up very badly at some point. Moses was a murderer, David a murderer and an adulterer. Yet we look back on these two as perhaps the greatest representatives of the Old Testament. Saul, who later became Paul, was a torturer of Christians. Peter was a traitor who deserted Jesus at his moment of greatest need. Yet God used these two to build his church. In fact, God can use anyone who opens their hands, who admits need, because grace, like water, flows down to the lowest part. It's when we fail, when we feel most inadequate, most aware of our defects, that God begins to work in us. I know that grace stirs up many questions, and we're going to go to our forgiveness expert and ask him a few of those questions. You remember Dr. Lewis Smedes from an earlier session. He's a retired professor from Fuller Seminary and the author of such books as Shame and Grace, Forgive and Forget, and The Art of Forgiving.
The most serious mistake about forgiving that I find in critics of forgiving is the notion that if you forgive somebody, It means you're soft on bad things and that you're willing to overlook them. You're a patsy. You think being a follower of Christ means you've got to be a doormat. And
Like us, many Christians still talk to Lou Smedes when they have a question about forgiveness. Lou suggests 5 common mistakes people often make in the process of forgiving. First, assuming that forgiving somebody is excusing them. It's not.
If you forgive somebody, it means you're saying to them, you didn't really mean it, you couldn't help it, so let's just forget it. But forgiving is not excusing. You excuse somebody when you decide you can't blame him. You forgive somebody when you do blame him. You hold him responsible.
A second mistake, assuming that forgiving something is the same as tolerance. It's not. Lou illustrates with a neighbor's story.
A drunk driver on our street ran over my 2-year-old boy. She said for 2 years, I dreamt that he'd have the most miserable of all lives, that he would suffer every bit as much as he's made me suffer, how I hated him. And after 2 years of my hate, I discovered that the man who killed my boy was killing me. Inside. I was dead inside. I went to my priest, asked him, what are we going to do? He said, well, there's only one thing for it, and that is to try to forgive. But he says, before we talk about that, we've got to do one thing first. We've got to form, in this town, a chapter of Mothers Against Drunk Driving. We want it to be known that you can forgive a drunk driver, but it doesn't mean you tolerate drunk driving.
A third forgiveness mistake. People expect instant results.
Forgiving is very often more like an IRA account that grows by small increments than like striking oil in your backyard. It takes time, and you have to do it over again. You backslide.
Fourth mistake. You have to run to the person and tell them.
And they do that very often when they're not prepared to tell them. And the other person isn't prepared to hear it. So they bungle it. They will say, I forgive you. What for? For that? You forgive me for that? Let me tell you what you did to me. And there you go all over again. So wait.
And the fifth common forgiveness mistake, you assume you've got to go back to the same relationship you had before. You don't.
As long as you stop the hate, and as long as you're willing to be a friend or a helper to that person and give him grace, that may be all that's possible for now. We'll see about tomorrow.
If the subject of grace begins to stir up more questions in you than answers, just remember, you're on the right track.